Chapter 1. A Chance Meeting in the Snow. Snow fell in thick, delicate flakes, swirling in the cold December air like whispers of forgotten dreams. The town of Evermere, dressed in twinkling lights and garlands, was alive with Christmas spirit. Carolers singing on cobbled streets, shop windows glowing with warmth, and laughter drifting from the market square. But despite the festive charm, Celeste Montgomery felt nothing but the weight of loneliness pressing against her chest. Bundled in her long wool coat, she wandered aimlessly through the town, her gloved hands tucked deep into her pockets. Evermere had been her sanctuary for the past month, a quiet escape from the life she had abandoned in the city, a life filled with broken promises and dreams that had slipped through her fingers like grains of sand. Here, she could disappear, melt into the backdrop of twinkling lights and snowy streets, a nameless figure among the holiday crowds. The scent of roasted chestnuts and spiced cider filled the air as she passed the bustling Christmas market. Couples walked hand in hand. Children tugged on their parents' sleeves, begging for candy canes and gingerbread men. It was the kind of joy Celeste once believed in, the kind that had once painted her world in brilliant colors. But now, all she saw were shades of gray. She turned a corner, stepping into a quieter part of town where the glow of street lamps reflected on the snow-dusted pavement. That was when she saw him. A lone figure stood beneath a flickering lamppost, his silhouette etched against the falling snow. He was tall, his dark coat dusted with white, a scarf wrapped loosely around his neck. He was staring up at the sky, as if searching for something in the silent descent of snowflakes. Celeste hesitated. There was something hauntingly beautiful about the way he stood there, completely still, as if lost in a world of his own. For reasons she couldn't explain, she found herself stepping closer. "Do you ever wonder?" The man suddenly spoke, his voice low and rich. "If the snow remembers where it's been?" Celeste blinked, startled. She hadn't expected him to acknowledge her presence, let alone speak to her. She studied him, noting the sharp angles of his face, the distant look in his storm-gray eyes. "I don't know," she murmured, tilting her head slightly, "but I think it prefers to forget." A faint smile ghosted across his lips. "That would make two of us." The cryptic response sent a shiver down her spine, though she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the strange pull of this man's presence. She should have walked away, should have let the moment pass like all the others, but something rooted her to the spot. "Are you just passing through?" she asked, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant. He exhaled, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Maybe. I haven't decided yet." She studied him, noting the way his hands were clenched inside his pockets, as if he were holding onto something unseen. He had the look of someone running from something, perhaps from the same kind of ghosts that haunted her. "Well," she said after a moment, offering a small, uncertain smile, "if you do decide to stay, Evermere isn't the worst place to be, especially on Christmas Eve." His eyes met hers, something unreadable flickering in their depths. "Maybe I'll stay just long enough to see if that's true." A gust of wind sent snowflakes dancing between them, and for a moment, the rest of the world faded. It was just the two of them, two strangers standing beneath the soft glow of a street lamp, caught in the quiet magic of a winter night. Neither of them knew that this meeting, this fleeting conversation in the snow, would change everything. Chapter 2. Strangers Under Starlight. Celeste had always believed that moments of significance came with warning signs, a quickened heartbeat, a whisper of intuition, a shift in the air that heralded change. But standing beneath the flickering lamplight, speaking to a stranger whose name she did not know, she felt none of those things. There was only an unshakable stillness, as if time itself had settled in the hush of falling snow. Rowan, though she did not yet know that was his name, stood just a few feet away, his posture easy yet guarded. His words had carried a weight she could not quite define, as if he was speaking less to her and more to the night itself. The notion made her curious, but she hesitated to pry. She understood the need for silence better than most. The Christmas bells chimed in the distance, their deep, melodic toll drifting through the crisp air. The town had quieted now, most people having retreated to the warmth of their homes. Only the glow of festive lights and the crunch of snow beneath distant footsteps remained. "Are you waiting for someone?" she found herself asking, the question slipping past her lips before she could consider it. Rowan glanced at her, an almost imperceptible flicker of amusement crossing his expression. "No. Are you?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Just walking." A ghost of a smile curved his lips. "Then we have that in common." Silence stretched between them, but it was not the uncomfortable kind. It was the sort that existed when two people shared the same quiet understanding, neither rushing to fill the space with unnecessary words. Celeste shifted on her feet, glancing at the snow-laden path ahead. The street curved toward the town's small frozen lake, where lanterns had been strung across the trees, casting long, golden reflections upon the ice. It was a beautiful sight, one that had always made her feel strangely weightless, as though she could step onto the glassy surface and disappear into its depths. "Do you ever feel like you don't belong anywhere?" Rowan's voice broke the silence, low and contemplative. Celeste turned to him, surprised by the question. It was an odd thing to ask a stranger, yet something about it resonated deeply within her. She thought of the city she had left behind, of the pieces of herself she had abandoned there. "Yes," she admitted softly. "More often than I'd like to." Rowan exhaled a quiet breath, tilting his head to watch the sky. "Me too." For a moment, neither of them said anything, the stillness wrapping around them like a thread binding their separate stories together. Then, as if compelled by some unseen force, Celeste took a small step forward. "Would you like to walk with me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rowan studied her, as though weighing the offer carefully. Then, with a slow nod, he fell into step beside her. Together, they walked beneath the starlit sky, two strangers bound by a moment neither of them yet understood. Chapter 3. A Promise with No Tomorrow. The lake shimmered under the glow of lanterns, their golden light stretching long and delicate across the frozen surface. The world around Celeste and Rowan had fallen into a hush, the snow absorbing all sound but the faint whisper of their footsteps crunching beneath them. As they walked along the winding path, the night felt surreal, suspended between dream and reality. Celeste pulled her coat tighter around her, feeling the cold creep through the wool. She hadn't intended to spend so much time outside, but something about Rowan made her linger. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a quiet solace that neither of them had expected to find in a stranger. "Why Evermere?" Rowan's voice was soft, yet there was a weight to his question. She hesitated, her gaze trailing over the lake's frozen expanse. "My grandmother lived here. I used to visit every winter when I was younger. When she passed, I thought, maybe I could find some part of her here." Rowan nodded, as if he understood grief in a way words couldn't explain. "And have you?" Celeste exhaled, watching her breath curl into the night. "Not in the way I hoped, but being here, it makes the loneliness quieter." Rowan's expression shifted, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Loneliness is tricky that way. It never truly leaves, just changes shape. They walked in silence for a while, each lost in thought. Snowflakes continued to fall in slow, deliberate spirals, dusting their hair and shoulders. Celeste stole a glance at Rowan. He carried himself with a certain guardedness, as though he belonged to the night itself, transient, fleeting. "And you?" she asked. "Are you just passing through?" He was quiet for a long moment before answering. I suppose I am. Celeste frowned, sensing an evasion in his words. But why here? Why Evermere? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Maybe I was meant to be here. Maybe you were. She didn't know how to respond to that. There was something about the way he said it that sent a shiver through her, a feeling that she was standing at the edge of something unknown, something significant. They reached a wooden bench dusted with snow, nestled beneath a towering pine tree. Celeste hesitated before brushing the snow off the seat and sitting down. Rowan followed suit, his gaze fixed on the lake's frozen surface. If you could have one wish tonight, Rowan murmured, what would it be? Celeste thought for a moment before answering. To know that everything I've lost hasn't been in vain, that there's still something ahead worth hoping for. Rowan turned his head slightly, watching her in the dim glow of the lanterns. And if there isn't? She gave a small, sad smile. Then I suppose I keep walking. Rowan exhaled slowly, as if turning her words over in his mind. Maybe that's all any of us can do. A comfortable silence stretched between them, the night wrapping around them like a whispered secret. Celeste wasn't sure how much time had passed before Rowan spoke again. Let's make a promise. She turned to him, intrigued. What kind of promise? His gaze was steady, unwavering. Just for tonight, let's pretend the world doesn't exist beyond this place. No past, no future. Just now. Celeste felt her heart skip a beat. It was reckless, irrational, and yet something about it felt right. Okay, she whispered. Just for tonight. Rowan extended his gloved hand. After a moment's hesitation, she took it. His fingers were warm against hers, his grip steady. And as the snow continued to fall around them, they sat together beneath the stars, bound by a promise with no tomorrow. Chapter 4. Footprints that fade. The night had settled in, and the world outside Celeste's apartment was blanketed in snow. It was the kind of night that made the world feel smaller, quieter, like everything was waiting for something to change. Inside, Celeste sat by her window, staring out into the vast, empty street below. The snowfall, though beautiful, was a constant reminder of the storm within her, one she could never quite shake off. She had tried to ignore the growing pull between herself and Rowan, but it was hard to ignore the way he made her feel, even from a distance. His presence, though quiet, had a depth that left her wanting more. But she couldn't allow herself to get too close. She had made that mistake before. She remembered their last conversation with a mix of longing and fear. The way Rowan had looked at her, his gaze intense and filled with something she wasn't sure how to name, had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She had turned away, fearing what she might see if she let him in. She had turned away from so many things in her life, and she wasn't sure she was ready to change that now. But something was different. There was an undercurrent in her heart that she couldn't deny, no matter how much she tried to push it aside. Rowan was a mystery, yes, but there was something familiar in him, something that felt as if it had been there all along. Just then, her phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping her out of her thoughts. She reached for it, her heart racing slightly when she saw Rowan's name on the screen. Can we meet? She stared at the message for a long moment, her pulse quickening. She knew this was coming. She had felt it in her bones that something was about to shift between them, and now, it seemed, the moment had arrived. Where? She typed back, her fingers trembling slightly. The old bridge by the lake. Midnight. The words sent a chill down her spine. The lake. It was a place she hadn't visited in years, a place full of memories she wasn't sure she wanted to relive. But the urgency in Rowan's message was undeniable, and part of her felt a pull she couldn't resist. She quickly threw on her coat, scarf, and gloves, and left the apartment, her mind spinning with questions. What could Rowan possibly want to talk about? Why the lake? What was it that had drawn him to her in this way? As she walked through the snow-covered streets, her thoughts were a whirlwind. The world around her was eerily quiet, the snow falling in thick, soft sheets that seemed to muffle every sound. It felt like she was walking through a dream, each step taking her further into the unknown. When she reached the lake, the old bridge stood in the distance, bathed in the silvery light of the moon. Rowan was already there, standing at the far end of the bridge, his silhouette barely visible against the darkness. He didn't turn when she approached, but she could feel his awareness, as if he had been waiting for her all along. "Rowan," Celeste said softly, her voice carrying across the stillness. He turned slowly, his face half-shadowed in the dim light. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something raw, something that made her heart race. He took a step toward her, the crunch of his boots in the snow breaking the silence. "I didn't want to bring you here," he began, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "But I needed you to understand. I needed you to know." Celeste's heart skipped a beat. "Know what?" Rowan took another step closer, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce intensity that made her breath catch. "The truth," he said simply. The word hung in the air between them, heavy and charged with meaning. Celeste felt a pang of unease twist in her stomach. The truth. It was something she had been running from for so long, something that had always been just out of reach. "What truth?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Rowan hesitated, as if weighing whether or not to continue. Then, with a deep breath, he spoke. "The truth about why I came here," he said, his voice low but steady. "About why I've been following you." Celeste's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. "Following me?" she echoed. "What do you mean?" Rowan's gaze softened slightly, and he stepped closer again, his presence overwhelming in the quiet night. "I came here because I knew you were here. I've been looking for you, Celeste." She took a step back, her pulse quickening. "Looking for me? Why? How do you know me?" Rowan's eyes flickered with something Celeste couldn't quite place. Pain, perhaps, or regret. But whatever it was, it made her chest tighten. "I know you," he said softly. "I've known you for a long time." Celeste's breath caught in her throat. The words seemed impossible, but the way Rowan looked at her made her wonder if there was more to him, more to their connection than she had ever realized. "I don't understand," she whispered. "How can you know me?" Rowan looked down, his expression troubled. When he met her eyes again, there was a quiet desperation in his gaze. "I was there, Celeste. I was there when you needed me most. But I couldn't stay. I had to let you go." The world around her seemed to fade as his words sank in, and for a moment, she felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The past, long buried and forgotten, was suddenly right there in front of her. Rowan took her hands in his, the warmth of his touch grounding her. "You don't remember, do you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Celeste shook her head, unable to speak. She didn't understand. How could she have forgotten him? How could she have forgotten everything he was telling her now? "I'm not the man you think I am," Rowan said quietly, "but I'm the man who's been waiting for you." And as he spoke, the weight of his words, the depth of their meaning, settled over Celeste like a heavy cloak. She had no idea what was happening, no idea what the truth really was. But one thing was certain. This moment, this encounter, was only the beginning of a much bigger story. Chapter 5. The Mystery of Rowan. The chill of the night seemed to hang in the air even as Celeste stood frozen on the old bridge, her hands still clasped tightly in Rowan's. His words echoed in her mind, growing louder with each passing second. "I'm the man who's been waiting for you." It was as if a veil had been lifted from her eyes, revealing a world she wasn't prepared for. Rowan's grip tightened slightly, as if he, too, was trying to hold on to something that felt both fragile and inevitable. But Celeste couldn't move. The weight of his words had paralyzed her, and the rest of the world seemed to disappear. Only the snow, gently falling around them, remained, an endless blanket that muffled the sounds of the world, leaving only the rush of her own heartbeat in her ears. "Rowan, what do you mean?" Celeste finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling. "How could you have been waiting for me?" He looked at her then, his expression a mix of pain and longing, as if her confusion was something he had expected but feared. He took a step back, allowing her space to breathe, but still kept his eyes on hers, never breaking the connection. "I don't know how to explain it," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent so much time wondering how to make you understand. But I think you're starting to remember, aren't you?" Celeste felt the sting of his words hit her like a sudden gust of wind. Remember? She was certain she had no memory of him, not in the way he was implying. She tried to push through the fog in her mind, but it only thickened. There was a part of her that felt something, a fleeting sensation, as if something long buried had stirred, just out of reach. But it wasn't enough to bring clarity. I don't understand." Her voice cracked as she spoke, the uncertainty flooding her once again. "I don't remember anything like this. I don't know you. I don't know why you're saying these things." Rowan ran a hand through his hair, frustration and sorrow crossing his features. "I know it's hard to believe, but Celeste, you've always known me. In another time, in another life." Celeste took a step back, shaking her head. No, this doesn't make any sense. I would remember. I would know. I would have felt it." Rowan's eyes softened, and for a moment, Celeste could see the depth of his regret. He was hurting too. She could feel it in the air between them, like a magnetic force pulling them closer and yet keeping them apart. "I know you don't remember." "Not yet," Rowan said, his voice gentle, but full of an unspoken plea. "But I need you to trust me. I can't tell you everything all at once. It's too much. But I swear to you, everything I've done, everything I've been through, it's all been for this moment. For you." Celeste felt her breath catch in her throat. The trust he was asking of her, the weight of his words, was too much for her to process. She needed space. She needed time to think. Her mind was still in chaos, trying to piece together this truth he was offering her, this impossible reality that now seemed to be slowly unfolding before her. "I need time," she whispered, her eyes downcast, as if by doing so, she could hold the breaking pieces of her heart together. "I need to understand this." Rowan nodded, as if he had been expecting this response. "I know, but I won't leave. I'll be here when you're ready." Celeste didn't know how to respond. What could she say? She didn't know if she was ready for what Rowan was offering her, or if she ever would be. Her mind was still caught in the past she was sure she'd forgotten. Yet the more Rowan spoke, the more she felt like something was calling to her from the depths of that past. Rowan's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer before he turned to leave, his figure fading into the snow-covered night. Celeste stood there alone for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing in on her. As the snow continued to fall, each flake a soft reminder of the distance between the present and whatever future was now in front of her. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and hesitation. Celeste's every waking moment was filled with thoughts of Rowan, of the words he had said, the weight of his presence hanging over her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, his eyes filled with an intensity that left her breathless, yet also afraid. It had been hard to return to her normal life. She went through the motions, but her mind always drifted back to that night on the bridge, to the unanswered questions, to the feeling that something deep within her was beginning to shift, but she couldn't fully understand why. She had tried to shut him out, tried to focus on other things. The job that she had so carefully built for herself, the small apartment that she had made her own. But it wasn't enough. The pieces of her life that had once fit neatly together now felt out of place, like mismatched puzzle pieces. One afternoon, Celeste sat by her small kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold in front of her. Her fingers traced the rim of the cup absently as she stared out the window. It was another gray day, the clouds hanging low in the sky, the snow falling in soft, silent waves. The world outside seemed quiet, as if waiting for something, too. Her phone buzzed once again, breaking the silence. She looked down, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Rowan's name. "Can we talk?" It was simple, the request not unlike the many others he had made. But this time, something felt different. She couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to know the truth. She had to understand what had been hidden from her, why Rowan was so insistent that they shared a past she couldn't remember. "Where?" She texted back, her fingers shaking slightly. "The lake. Tonight." She stared at the screen for a moment before her thumb hovered over the keys. It was as if something deep inside her had already made the decision for her. "I'll be there." The evening arrived quickly, and once again, Celeste found herself walking the snow-covered streets, her breath visible in the frigid air. The lake was peaceful, its surface reflecting the pale light of the moon. The only sound the soft crunch of her boots on the snow. Rowan was waiting for her by the water's edge, his figure outlined against the backdrop of the dark sky. He didn't turn when he heard her approach, but she knew he was aware of her presence. She walked toward him slowly, her heart pounding with every step. Tonight, she would ask the questions that had been burning in her mind for days. Tonight, she would uncover the truth, whether she was ready or not. "Rowan," she said softly, her voice carrying across the quiet air. He turned, his face as unreadable as ever. But this time, there was no hesitation, no regret. "This time, I'll tell you everything," Rowan said, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, unwavering certainty. "The truth, Celeste. All of it." Chapter 6. A heartbeat in the silence. The cold night air wrapped around Celeste like an invisible cloak, her breath coming out in visible puffs, mingling with the mist that hovered over the lake's frozen surface. The snow had stopped falling for now, leaving behind a world blanketed in pure white stillness. Yet despite the quiet beauty of the scene, a storm brewed inside her. A storm of confusion, doubt, and an unspoken fear that the truth she was about to face might break something irreparably within her. Rowan stood at the water's edge, his back to her, still as a statue. The moonlight bathed his figure in a soft glow, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. His presence felt both comforting and ominous, and Celeste couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would change everything. She had been running from this moment for so long, but now that it had arrived, she felt powerless to stop it. She took a deep breath, pushing through the unease that gnawed at her. There was no turning back now. "Rowan," she called again, her voice steady but carrying a quiet urgency. "What are you going to tell me?" Rowan didn't immediately turn to face her. Instead, he stood there for a moment longer, as though gathering his thoughts, his fingers twitching at his sides, the weight of the moment pressing on him as much as it did on her. "Celeste," he spoke her name softly, almost reverently, like he was savoring it. Finally, he turned to face her, and the intensity in his eyes made her heart stutter. His gaze was full of something she couldn't fully understand. Longing, pain, and a depth of emotion that felt both foreign and intimate at the same time. "I don't know where to begin," Rowan said, running a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "There's so much to explain, so much you need to know." Celeste stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking with every second. "Just start at the beginning," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Yet there was an undeniable strength in her tone. "I don't know what you're talking about," but I need to know. I need to understand what's happening." Rowan nodded, his gaze softening, and for the first time since they'd met, he seemed to falter. There was a rawness to him now, as if the walls he had so carefully built around himself were beginning to crumble. "I'm not like other people, Celeste," he began, his voice quieter than before. "I haven't been like other people for a long time." Celeste's heart rate quickened, the unease that had settled in her chest slowly transforming into something sharper, more intense. She could feel the words coming, but they were just out of reach, like the final piece of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to complete. "You don't remember me." "Not really," Rowan continued, his eyes locking onto hers with an unspoken sadness. "But I remember you. I've always remembered you. And I've been waiting for you to remember me." Celeste's breath hitched, waiting for me to remember him. The words haunted her, clashing with the reality she had known. She couldn't understand how she could have forgotten him, how anyone could forget something that felt so important. But his words carried a truth she couldn't ignore. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but it trembled with the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions. "Why keep it from me?" Rowan's expression darkened, his eyes filled with regret. He took a step toward her, and Celeste instinctively took a step back, uncertain whether the closeness would bring comfort or further confusion. "I couldn't tell you," Rowan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want to hurt you. There's a part of me that knew you weren't ready to hear it, and I had to let you come to it on your own. But I couldn't stay away any longer. I couldn't watch you go through your life, knowing the truth and being unable to share it with you." Celeste felt her stomach tighten, a knot of fear slowly forming in the pit of her belly. She wanted to run, to escape this conversation, but she couldn't. There was something about Rowan's words, about the rawness of his voice, that kept her rooted to the spot. "What is this truth?" she asked, her voice shaking now, betraying her own growing anxiety. "What is it that you're not telling me?" Rowan hesitated, the space between them stretching, as if he was weighing whether or not to tell her the whole story. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. "You and I," Rowan said slowly, "we've been connected before. In another life. Another time." Celeste felt her pulse race as she processed his words. Another life. Another time. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her mind was struggling to grasp the implications of what he was saying, struggling to reconcile it with everything she thought she knew. "I don't understand," she whispered, shaking her head. "This doesn't make sense. Are you saying that we've met before? That we've known each other in some other life?" Rowan's gaze softened, and he stepped closer, his voice a low murmur. "Yes, I know it's hard to believe. I know it sounds impossible, but it's true. In another time, in another life, we were in love. And I lost you." Celeste's breath caught in her throat as the words hit her like a physical blow. "In love, and I lost you." The weight of those words pressed against her chest, squeezing the breath from her lungs. "Lost me?" she echoed, her mind spinning with the implications. "How? What happened?" Rowan closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, they were filled with a deep, unrelenting sorrow. "I don't remember everything, not all the details, but I know that I failed you. I let you go, and when I finally found you again, I couldn't remember who I was to you. But I knew you were the one I had been searching for." The tears that Celeste hadn't realized had been building up finally spilled over, her vision blurring as the weight of Rowan's confession hit her. "In love, and I lost you." The words echoed in her mind, and for the first time, Celeste felt as though the fog that had clouded her past was beginning to lift, just enough for her to catch a glimpse of something she had long since forgotten. "But why don't I remember?" Celeste asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why can't I remember any of this? Rowan's eyes darkened, his face tightening with an emotion she couldn't quite place. Because you were made to forget. The word stung, and Celeste took a step back, her heart racing. Made to forget? She repeated, her voice rising. Who made me forget? Why? Rowan's gaze flickered to the lake, the moonlight reflecting off the frozen surface like a mirror. It's a long story, a story that's been hidden from you. But Celeste, you need to understand, there are forces at play that you don't know. Forces that have kept us apart. But I won't let them keep us apart anymore. I won't. Celeste's world seemed to tilt, the gravity of Rowan's words pulling her into a new reality, one she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The truth was more complicated than she could have imagined, and yet it felt strangely inevitable. She had been running from something, and now it was standing in front of her, in the form of Rowan, the man who had always been there, even when she didn't know it. I don't know if I can accept all of this, Celeste said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and awe. I don't know if I can accept us. Rowan stepped closer, his expression gentle but determined. You don't have to accept everything right now, but you don't have to run from this, Celeste. I'm here, and I won't let you go this time. For the first time in what felt like forever, Celeste allowed herself to feel something. Something beyond the confusion and fear. She didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope. Chapter 7. Whispers Beneath the Lamplight. The world around Celeste seemed to grow quieter with each step she took away from the lake, the snow now falling again in thick, heavy flakes, obscuring everything in a gentle haze. Her heart pounded in her chest, still reeling from the truth Rowan had just shared with her. You were made to forget. The words echoed through her mind, impossibly heavy, pulling her in 1,000 different directions. How could she even begin to process something so unfathomable? That she and Rowan, the man she barely knew, had once been in love? That they were somehow connected, bound by some force neither of them fully understood? Her hands trembled at her sides as she walked, the cold biting at her skin, but it was nothing compared to the chill creeping into her soul. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the silence around her swallowing everything. Her thoughts, her confusion, her fear. She had never been one to shy away from questions or the pursuit of answers, but this was different. This was something entirely beyond the realm of her understanding. The path she followed led her back toward the town, though she barely noticed the streets now, the familiar buildings and streets feeling alien, as though they no longer belonged to the same world she had known. Everything seemed unfamiliar now, even though it had been the backdrop to her life for so long. How was it possible that in the midst of this small, quiet town, so much was hidden from her? How was it possible that she had been living her life, thinking it was all normal, when in fact there was someone, so significant just out of her reach? The night air, sharp and cold against her skin, did little to shake the feeling that she was losing herself in something she didn't yet understand. And Rowan's promise that he would stay and wait for her echoed like a lifeline. But even that felt like it was pulling her into an unknown abyss. Was it really Rowan she knew? The man standing before her was familiar in a way she couldn't describe, yet distant in the same breath. How could he ask her to believe in something as fantastical as another life? How could he expect her to embrace a love she had no memory of? Celeste. The voice was soft, familiar, but it still made her heart race. She stopped in her tracks, turning to find Rowan a few steps behind her, his silhouette barely visible in the swirling snow. Her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't move. Rowan, she whispered, the word feeling strange on her lips, like a fragile thread holding her to something she wasn't sure she wanted to cling to. He was closer now, his boots crunching against the snow, but his eyes never left hers. There was a gentleness to his gaze that made her heart ache, even as her mind tried to rebel against the emotions welling up inside her. She wanted to fight it, to push away the undeniable pull between them, but something in her knew she couldn't. She wasn't ready, but she couldn't deny the truth any longer. "I know you're scared," Rowan said, his voice quiet but full of certainty. "I can see it in your eyes, Celeste, but you don't have to face this alone. I'm here. I've always been here." His words settled over her like a soft, insistent whisper in the wind. There was truth in them, something that reached deep into her soul and stirred the parts of her she hadn't even known were dormant. But the doubt, the fear, the uncertainty, those were the emotions that kept her from taking that next step. She couldn't jump into something she didn't understand, no matter how much he seemed to mean to her, no matter how much his presence felt like it was somehow meant to be. "I don't know how to do this," Celeste admitted, the vulnerability in her voice more painful than she had expected. "I don't know how to just believe what you're telling me. It's too much. It doesn't make sense. And I don't even know who I am in this story." Rowan closed the gap between them, standing in front of her now, but his expression was softer than it had been before. His hand reached for hers, gently, carefully, as though afraid she might pull away at any moment. When her fingers reluctantly found his touch felt grounding, something familiar amidst the storm in her mind. "I can't give you all the answers right away," he said, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in slow, rhythmic motions. "But I can tell you this, Celeste. You are part of this story. You always have been. And no matter how much time it takes for you to remember, I will wait for you." His words filled her with a strange sense of peace, but it wasn't enough to quell the storm inside. She was afraid of who she had been, afraid of who she was becoming. And yet, as her hand remained in his, there was a quiet certainty building in her heart, an inexplicable trust in the way his touch made her feel. Even in the uncertainty, she couldn't deny the pull. "I don't know if I can remember," Celeste said, her voice barely above a whisper, the vulnerability in her words hanging heavily in the air between them. "I don't know if I can trust you, or if I can trust myself." But she paused, meeting his gaze, her heart aching with the desire to believe him, to believe in something beyond the fear that had kept her locked in place. "But maybe I'll try." Rowan's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, the world around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the quiet warmth of their connection. He squeezed her hand gently, a silent promise passing between them. "That's all I'm asking for, Celeste. Just give me a chance." They stood there for a long time, their hands intertwined, the weight of their shared silence heavier than any words could be. The snow continued to fall around them, and the world seemed to slow, as though holding its breath for the decision she had yet to make. But in that moment, with Rowan by her side, Celeste couldn't help but feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as lost as she had once believed. The following days were a blur for Celeste. She tried to return to her life, to the routine she had so carefully built, but everything felt different now. The town, once familiar, now felt foreign. Its streets, its shops, its people, all carrying a weight that she couldn't ignore. Her mind kept drifting back to the lake, to the truth Rowan had shared with her, and to the connection she felt but didn't fully understand. It wasn't that she didn't want to remember. It wasn't that she didn't want to believe in what Rowan had told her. But there were parts of her past, fragments of memories that she couldn't quite piece together, that kept her from embracing the unknown. One evening, as Celeste walked home from the small cafe where she worked, she saw him again. Rowan was standing outside, just beyond the mist of falling snow, his figure half hidden in the darkness. He was waiting for her, as he always did now, a constant presence at the edges of her life. "Celeste," he said, his voice low, carrying a hint of quiet urgency. "There's something I need to show you." She hesitated for a moment before nodding, her heart quickening with both anticipation and fear. She didn't know what this was, what he was about to reveal, but she had already given him a piece of her trust. Maybe it was time to give him the rest. Together, they walked into the night, their path lit only by the dim glow of street lamps, the snow falling around them like whispered secrets that only they could hear. And for the first time in a long while, Celeste allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was something more to this life, and to her connection with Rowan, than she had ever imagined. Chapter 8. The Secrets We Never Tell. The morning sun was a pale ghost through the thick layers of snow that blanketed the town, casting a faint light on the world that seemed to be suspended between dusk and dawn. Celeste wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck as she made her way down the street, her boots crunching against the frosty pavement. The chill in the air stung her cheeks, but it wasn't the cold that had her on edge. It was the weight of the decision she was carrying, one that grew heavier with each passing day. Rowan's presence, his words, the promises he had made. It was all too much, too soon. How could she believe in something so impossible? How could she trust him when the past he spoke of felt like a distant dream, unreachable and blurred? The town around her was quiet, the usual bustle of the morning subdued by the storm that had swept through the night before. The streets were mostly empty, save for a few early risers trudging through the snow, their breaths misting in the frigid air. But Celeste couldn't focus on them. Her thoughts kept circling back to Rowan, to the secrets he had shared with her, and to the parts of herself that were still hidden from view. As she walked past the town square, she spotted the old church at the end of the street. The bell tower stood tall, the ancient stone walls covered in ivy and frost, a symbol of the town's long history. It was a place she had always passed by but never given much thought to. Today, however, something about it called to her. Something inside her stirred, as if the very walls held a secret she was meant to uncover. Without thinking, Celeste turned and made her way toward the church. The doors creaked softly as she pushed them open, stepping into the cool, quiet interior. The scent of old wood and incense hung in the air, and the faint sound of her footsteps echoed off the stone floors as she wandered further inside. The church was empty, save for a few candles flickering near the altar. She moved toward them, her fingers brushing against the cold pews as she passed. The quiet was overwhelming, and in that silence, her thoughts seemed to grow louder, more insistent. What is it I'm supposed to remember? She stopped at the altar, her gaze falling on the worn wood, the delicate carvings of angels and flowers. There was something about this place, something about its stillness, that felt strangely familiar, as though she had been here before, though she couldn't remember when or why. The sound of a door creaking behind her broke the stillness, and Celeste turned, startled. Her breath caught in her throat as Rowan stepped into the church, his tall figure silhouetted against the soft light from the doorway. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as though the world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Rowan took a step forward, his boots silent on the stone floor. He didn't seem surprised to find her there, though Celeste could feel the tension between them, thick and palpable. His gaze softened, and for a brief moment, it was as if the weight of everything they had shared in the past few days had settled between them. "I didn't know if you would come," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same warmth that had always comforted her, even when she had no idea why. "But I hoped you would." Celeste didn't know what to say. There were so many questions, so many things she needed to understand. But the words seemed to catch in her throat, too tangled in emotion and fear to find their way out. "I don't understand," she admitted, her voice small and fragile in the vast silence of the church. "How can this be real? How can we be real when everything you've told me feels like a dream I can't wake from?" Rowan stepped closer, his presence a comforting weight that settled beside her. I know it's hard to believe. It's hard for me too, sometimes. But we are real, Celeste. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. You just have to remember. And I know you will when the time is right. Celeste shook her head, frustration welling up inside her. I can't just remember something that doesn't feel real. I don't know who I was before, Rowan. I don't know what you're asking of me. He took her hand gently, his fingers warm against her cold skin. I'm not asking you to remember everything at once. I'm asking you to trust me, to trust that what we have is real, even if it doesn't make sense right now. Her heart fluttered at his touch, but her mind remained clouded. She couldn't ignore the feeling of something missing, the emptiness that seemed to echo inside her, no matter how much she wanted to hold on to the connection she felt with him. Was it real? Was she really the person he claimed her to be? Or was she merely part of some elaborate illusion he had woven around her? The doubt gnawed at her, growing larger with every passing moment. Rowan seemed to sense her hesitation, and his grip on her hand tightened, as though reassuring her that he wouldn't let go. Celeste, I'm not asking for you to remember everything now. All I want is for you to be here, with me, in this moment. To let me show you the truth, piece by piece. Celeste closed her eyes, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. The pull between them was undeniable, the connection as real as the air she breathed. Yet the fear that held her back seemed to grow stronger the more she tried to resist it. She didn't want to be afraid. She didn't want to lose herself in the mystery of who she had been. But with Rowan standing there, his steady presence grounding her, she felt a flicker of hope. She opened her eyes and looked at him, meeting his gaze with a quiet resolve. I'm here, she said softly. I'm willing to try. Rowan smiled, a smile that reached his eyes and softened the lines of his face. That's all I ask. We'll take it slow. Together. The silence between them deepened, but it was no longer oppressive. Instead, it was filled with a quiet understanding, a bond that transcended the words they spoke. Celeste didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, standing in the quiet sanctuary of the church with Rowan by her side, she finally felt like she was on the brink of something she had been searching for her entire life. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The days that followed were a blur of small moments, quiet walks through the snow, shared glances, and tentative conversations. Celeste still struggled with the idea of her past, but Rowan was patient, always there to offer comfort when the doubt threatened to overwhelm her. Every day felt like a step forward, even if it was only a small one. One evening, as they walked together under the stars, Rowan stopped, turning to face her. The air was crisp, and the snow had begun to fall again, a soft blanket covering the world around them. Celeste, he said, his voice low and steady, there's something I need to show you, something that might help you understand. She looked at him, her heart racing. What is it? Rowan took a deep breath, as though gathering his strength, and then, with a look that said everything she needed to know, he took her hand. Come with me. It's time to remember. And as they walked toward the unknown, Celeste's heart beat faster with each step, the weight of their shared history pulling her forward until she could no longer ignore the truth of their connection. The past was waiting, just beyond the horizon, and for the first time in a long while, Celeste felt ready to face it. The snow fell softly around them, and for a fleeting moment, the world seemed to pause, waiting for the story to unfold. Chapter 9. A Kiss Before Midnight. The wind had shifted by the time they arrived at the edge of the town. The once peaceful snowfall had thickened into a dense flurry, swirling around them in a chaotic dance. Celeste wrapped her coat tighter around herself, trying to shield her face from the biting cold, but the chill in the air didn't seem to reach her. Her heart raced with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension as Rowan led her further away from the familiar streets of the town, toward the darkened woods that lay just beyond the last row of houses. Her feet crunched in the snow, each step feeling heavier than the last as she followed Rowan into the shadow of the trees. The night seemed to grow darker with each passing minute, the only light coming from the faint glow of the stars above. It was almost as though the world had fallen away, leaving only the two of them suspended in the quiet, cold embrace of the forest. "Where are we going?" Celeste asked, her voice barely rising above the whisper of the wind. Rowan glanced back at her, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that spoke of secrets, of truths yet to be revealed. "We're almost there," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I promise it's worth the walk." The path ahead was narrow and winding, the snow deeper here, untouched by footprints, making it feel as though they were the only two people left in the world. Celeste's breath fogged in the air, and for a moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes, letting the stillness of the night wash over her. It was peaceful in a way, but beneath the calm surface, there was an undercurrent of something more, something hidden just out of reach. After what felt like an eternity of walking, they arrived at a clearing. The trees surrounding them seemed to part as if on cue, revealing a small stone structure standing quietly in the center of the space. The sight of it took Celeste by surprise. She had never seen it before, and yet it felt familiar. It was an old stone well, its surface worn by time, the edges softened by years of weathering. Ivy and moss clung to its sides, and the stone surrounding the opening was chipped and cracked, as though it had been touched by countless hands over the years. But it wasn't the well itself that drew Celeste's attention. It was the way the light seemed to dance around it, casting strange, flickering shadows in the snow. Rowan stopped beside her, his breath coming in visible clouds in the cold night air. He was silent for a long moment, staring down at the well as if gathering his thoughts. Celeste's pulse quickened, the silence between them thick and heavy. "I know this is hard for you," Rowan finally said, his voice low, his words weighted with meaning. "But this place, it's where it all began. It's where you and I, where we started." Celeste frowned, her confusion deepening. "What do you mean? I've never seen this well before in my life." Rowan turned to face her, his expression gentle but resolute. "No, not this life, but the life before, the one you've forgotten." He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cool stone of the well, tracing a line along its surface. "This place holds the answers you've been searching for, Celeste. The key to everything." Her heart beat faster, her mind spinning with questions she didn't know how to ask. The life before. Rowan's words echoed in her mind, haunting her. Was this truly where it had all started? Was this where the memories she couldn't reach were hidden, locked away in the depths of her mind? The thought of uncovering a past she had no memory of terrified her. Yet there was a pull, something deep inside that told her she couldn't walk away from this. She couldn't walk away from him. "I don't understand," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't remember anything. I don't remember us." Rowan's gaze softened, and he stepped closer to her, his presence as steady as ever. "I know, but that's why we're here. This well, it's a part of our past. It's where you'll find the answers you need." Celeste hesitated, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. "How do you know?" she asked, her voice small. "How can you be so sure that I'll remember? That any of this is real?" Rowan's eyes locked with hers, and in that moment, she saw something. Something raw and vulnerable that made her heart ache. He was sharing a part of himself with her, a part that was more than just the promise of love, more than just a simple connection. It was a trust so deep, it felt like a bond that transcended time itself. "Because I've been waiting for you, Celeste," Rowan said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I've always been waiting, and I know that you remember more than you think." You just need to trust yourself." He placed his hand on her shoulder, a comforting weight, and slowly, gently, he guided her toward the well. Celeste could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the rhythm matching her footsteps as she approached the stone structure. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch the cold stone, her fingertips brushing the edges of the well's opening. The moment her hand made contact, the ground beneath her seemed to shift. A soft, ethereal glow began to emanate from the well, faint at first, then growing stronger with each passing second. The light danced around her, swirling like smoke, filling the air with an otherworldly energy. Celeste stumbled back, her heart racing. "What's happening?" she gasped, her voice trembling with fear and wonder. Rowan stood beside her, his eyes fixed on the glowing well, his face unreadable. "It's happening," he said softly, his voice filled with awe. "This is how it begins. The memories you've lost, the truth you've been searching for. It's all here, waiting for you." The light from the well grew brighter, until it seemed to fill the entire clearing, wrapping around them both like a cocoon. Celeste's breath caught in her throat as the glow pulsed, a rhythm she could almost feel in her bones. The air grew thick with something ancient, something powerful, and for a brief moment, Celeste felt a connection that stretched beyond the present, beyond the world she knew. She felt herself slipping into something she couldn't understand, something that wasn't hers to remember. Then, as quickly as it had come, the light faded, leaving only the dark silence of the woods. The snow continued to fall, soft and steady, but the clearing was still, as though the world was holding its breath. Celeste stood frozen, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. What had just happened? She turned to Rowan, but he was already looking at her, his expression unreadable. "Do you remember anything?" he asked, his voice quiet but urgent. Celeste's mind was a whirl of fragmented images, flashes of a life she couldn't place, a love she couldn't fully grasp. There were no words, no clear memories, but there was a feeling that something, someone, had been lost, and that somehow they were going to find it again. She whispered, her voice hoarse. "I don't know, but I felt something. Like I was supposed to know." Rowan's gaze softened, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "It's a start," he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "That's all we need. A start." As the night stretched on, and the snow continued to fall in soft, silent waves, Celeste knew that this was only the beginning. Whatever had happened in the past, whatever memories lay buried within her, they were starting to surface. And with Rowan by her side, she wasn't sure where this journey would take her, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to follow. The path ahead was uncertain, but with each step, it seemed less frightening. The past, the future, the love they had lost, it was all within reach now, and together, they would find their way. Chapter 10. Vanished like a dream. The days after the encounter with the well had passed in a blur for Celeste. The snow fell heavier each day, blanketing the town in a pristine layer of white, but the storm that had been swirling inside her was far from over. She had felt something at the well, something deep and stirring, but now it was slipping through her fingers like water, too fragile to hold. The memories were just out of reach, teasing her with fragments she couldn't piece together. Rowan had been quiet too, since that night. He watched her with a look in his eyes that she couldn't quite decipher, but she knew he was waiting for her to remember, waiting for her to understand. She had tried, more than once, to ask him what he knew, what he remembered, but he would only smile gently and say, "It's your memory to reclaim, Celeste. You have to trust it will come to you in time." Time. That word echoed in her mind like a distant bell tolling. marking the slow passage of her uncertainty. She didn't want to trust in time. She wanted the answers now. She needed to know what had happened, what was lost. Why was she so drawn to Rowan? Why did the well feel like a place she belonged, even though she had never seen it before? The days blurred into one another as Celeste found herself walking the same familiar streets of the town, passing by the snow-covered houses and twinkling lights. She would often stop at the town square, where the large Christmas tree stood, its ornaments glistening like stars against the night sky. But tonight, there was something different about the town. The cold felt sharper, the air thicker, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She stopped in front of a small cafe, her favorite spot to escape when the questions grew too heavy. She hadn't been inside in days, not since Rowan had taken her to the woods. But tonight she felt an inexplicable pull, something that urged her to step inside. The bell over the door jingled as she entered, and the warm, inviting scent of cinnamon and fresh-baked pastries greeted her. The cafe was almost empty, save for a few scattered patrons, and the soft hum of holiday music filled the air. Celeste found a seat by the window, where the view of the snow-covered streets seemed peaceful, even though her mind was anything but. As she settled into the cozy chair, her thoughts drifted back to Rowan. He had been distant these past few days, giving her space to work through her own emotions. But it wasn't just distance she felt. It was the weight of something unsaid, a tension that hung between them like an invisible thread. She couldn't deny it any longer. She had to confront the truth. Whatever had happened, whatever they had shared, it was time to face it. The cafe door jingled again, and Celeste's eyes lifted to see none other than Rowan standing in the doorway. He looked as though he had just stepped out of the pages of a winter fairy tale. His dark hair tousled by the wind, his coat dusted with snow, and his eyes shining with a quiet intensity that made her pulse quicken. He caught her gaze immediately and smiled, but it was a smile tinged with something deeper, something that spoke of shared history and unspoken feelings. "Mind if I join you?" Rowan asked, his voice smooth and warm, carrying an undertone of something more. Celeste nodded, her heart racing in her chest. "Of course, please." He slid into the seat across from her, his presence filling the space between them in a way that felt both natural and overwhelming. He didn't speak at first, simply watching her with that same quiet intensity. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The air around them seemed to hold its breath, just as the world outside was frozen in the stillness of winter. Then, at last, Rowan broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice hesitant but sincere, "about what we're doing here, about everything we've been through." Celeste felt her heart skip a beat. She had been thinking the same thing, but hearing it spoken aloud made her realize just how much was at stake. The past, the future, they were all tangled together in ways she hadn't yet understood. "I know it's been difficult," Rowan continued, his eyes searching hers. "I know that the memories haven't come back the way we hoped. But Celeste, I need you to understand something. The truth about us, it's not going to come all at once. It's going to take time. It's going to take patience." She swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. "I'm trying," she whispered. "I really am. But it's so frustrating. It's like a fog that won't lift. I feel like I'm standing on the edge of something important, and I can't remember what it is. I don't know if I can wait any longer." Rowan's expression softened, and for a moment, Celeste saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "I understand. Believe me, I do. But this isn't something you can force. The memories will come when you're ready to receive them, and I'll be here, right by your side, when they do. I know you're scared, but you're not alone, Celeste." His words sank deep into her heart, and for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope stir within her. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. The truth, whatever it was was within her reach. She just had to trust. For a long time, they sat there in silence, the world outside moving in a quiet blur as the snow continued to fall, as though time itself was slowing down for them. Rowan didn't press her for answers. He simply sat with her, offering his presence as a quiet reassurance. Celeste's fingers drummed lightly on the edge of her mug, her thoughts swirling. But as she looked out the window, she saw something that caught her attention, a flicker of movement in the distance. It was hard to make out through the snow, but something about the way the figure moved seemed familiar. Before she could say anything, Rowan followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice tight, as though he, too, had noticed the figure. Celeste's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure why, but a sudden sense of unease washed over her. I think I saw someone," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Rowan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His gaze darkened, and Celeste could feel the shift in his energy. "Stay here," he said, his tone more urgent than she had ever heard it. "Don't move." Before she could protest, Rowan had already stepped outside, his figure disappearing into the storm. Celeste's pulse quickened as she stood up, her heart pounding. She had no idea what was happening, but something about the stranger in the snow felt wrong, something that didn't add up. She hesitated for only a moment before she followed him out into the snow, the cold air biting at her skin as she stepped into the night. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was coming next, whatever was hidden just out of sight, was about to change everything. And this time, there would be no turning back. Chapter 11. The Note in the Snow. The night air was biting cold, and the snow swirled around Celeste, the tiny flakes dusting her cheeks and hair as she hurried after Rowan. The cafe door had barely closed behind her when she stepped into the thick blanket of white that had covered the streets. The world around her felt silent, almost unnervingly still, as if the snow had absorbed every sound, leaving nothing but a heavy, tense quiet. She called out softly, "Rowan," but her voice was swallowed by the storm. Rowan was already several steps ahead, moving with purpose, his figure cutting through the snow as if he knew exactly where he was going. She quickened her pace, her boots crunching in the deepening snow, but despite her urgency, the gap between them seemed to widen with each step. Her thoughts raced, spinning with questions that refused to settle. Who was the figure she had seen from the window? Why had it unsettled her so deeply? And why had Rowan reacted so sharply when he noticed it too? There was something in the way he moved, something almost predatory about his urgency, that made Celeste's skin prickle with unease. She pushed through the cold, her breath coming out in visible puffs as she struggled to catch up. The streetlights cast faint halos in the snow, their glow soft and diffused, like the light of distant stars. The town felt unreal, frozen in time, both familiar and hauntingly foreign at the same time. Finally, she caught up with Rowan as he stopped in front of a narrow alley between two old brick buildings, the shadows deep and heavy. She was close enough now to see the set of his jaw, the sharpness in his gaze, and the tension radiating off him. "What's going on?" Celeste asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound steady. "Who is that person?" Rowan turned to face her, his eyes narrowing slightly as if considering his words carefully. There was something guarded in his expression, a wariness that made Celeste's heart skip. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, scanning the darkness as if expecting something or someone else to emerge from the shadows. "I don't know," Rowan said finally, his voice low, filled with a quiet intensity. "But I'm not taking any chances." Celeste felt her stomach tighten. "What do you mean? You know who it is." Rowan didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the alley ahead, searching. Celeste's gaze flickered toward the same spot, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure she had seen earlier was gone, vanished into the night, but she couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that clung to the air. "I think it's someone from my past," Rowan murmured, almost to himself. "Someone who shouldn't be here. Someone who has no business in this town." Celeste's breath caught in her throat. "Your past?" He nodded once, his eyes dark with something Celeste couldn't quite place. There was a shadow there, something buried, something unresolved. "I don't want to go into it right now," Rowan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I've been running from my past for a long time, Celeste, and it's catching up to me." A cold shiver ran down her spine. "What does that mean? Are we in danger?" Rowan didn't answer right away, his gaze still trained on the alley, his body coiled with tension. "I'm not sure, but I can't let them hurt you." "Hurt her?" The words sent a ripple of shock through her, a strange mix of fear and confusion. She had known Rowan had a past, but this was something deeper, darker. Something that wasn't just about her or the present. It was about something from before, something dangerous that had followed him to this quiet town. Before she could ask anything else, there was a movement in the shadows, swift, deliberate. Someone, or something, was coming closer, the sound of footsteps muffled by the thick snow, but the steady rhythm unmistakable. Rowan's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with a firm grip that almost hurt. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low and commanding. Celeste's pulse quickened, her mind spinning with panic and confusion. She wanted to argue, to ask more questions, but something in the way he held her back silenced her. He wasn't just protecting her. He was preparing for something. Preparing for what, though? The figure emerged from the shadows, slowly at first, like a wraith materializing from the mist. Celeste's heart seemed to stop as she saw them more clearly. A tall, slender figure dressed in a long coat, their features obscured by the hood pulled low over their head. For a moment, all she could see were the faint outlines of their face, their eyes gleaming with an eerie light. The strangers stopped just at the edge of the alley, their presence somehow more imposing in the stillness of the night. Celeste couldn't breathe as the figure's gaze flickered between her and Rowan, their eyes intense, predatory, like they were weighing them both in some cruel judgment. Rowan stepped forward, pushing Celeste back slightly, as if shielding her. "I don't want any trouble," he said, his voice steady, though Celeste could hear the tension beneath it. "Leave this town. You're not welcome here." The figure didn't respond right away, their face hidden beneath the shadow of the hood. Then, finally, they spoke, their voice soft and chilling, like the wind cutting through the trees. "I'm not here for you, Rowan," the stranger said, their words deliberate, each one heavy with meaning. "I'm here for her." Celeste felt a chill slide down her spine at the mention of her name. How could this person know her? Who were they? And why had they come for her? Rowan stiffened, his body tense, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The moment the stranger had spoken, Celeste could sense the change in him, like a door that had been closed, now being opened to something much darker than she had ever known. "Who are you?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. The stranger's lips curled into something like a smile, but it didn't reach their eyes. "Someone who has waited a long time for you to remember, Celeste." She swallowed, the words like ice in her throat. What did that mean? How did they know her? And why was this happening now? Before she could ask another question, the stranger stepped back into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared, leaving only the soft crunch of snow in their wake. Rowan let out a slow breath, his shoulders sagging as the tension in his body finally began to ease. But Celeste couldn't shake the feeling that something had just begun, something that would change everything between them and everything about her past. Chapter 12, Following Shadows. The night was heavier now, colder, as if the world had decided to hold its breath in the aftermath of the stranger's cryptic words. The snow continued to fall, each flake silently joining the others, a blanket of white that muffled the world. But Celeste's thoughts were far from quiet. Her mind spun with questions, too many to count, too many to answer in the silence of the night. Who was the stranger? How did they know her name? And why had they singled her out? Rowan stood motionless, his back to her, staring into the dark alley where the figure had disappeared. His jaw was clenched, his posture rigid with the weight of something unspoken. Celeste's pulse thrummed in her ears, the only sound in the otherwise still world. The snowflakes that had been falling so gently now felt like shards of ice, the cold creeping into her bones. She took a hesitant step toward him, her boots crunching in the snow, but he didn't turn. His body was as still as stone, as though he had been frozen in place by the encounter. Celeste's heart ached at the sight of him, his back to her, a wall between them that hadn't been there before. "Rowan," she whispered, her voice barely cutting through the quiet. "What was that? Who was that person?" He turned slowly, his eyes dark and unreadable, a storm of emotions swirling within them. There was something raw in his gaze, something that made Celeste's heart ache with understanding. It was as though he was torn between protecting her and revealing a truth that neither of them was ready for. "They know about you," he said quietly, the words carrying a weight that made her blood run cold. "That's why they're here." Celeste shook her head, her mind struggling to keep up. "They know about me? What do you mean? How? Why?" Rowan took a deep breath, his hand running through his hair in frustration. His voice dropped lower, almost to a murmur. "I don't know all the details, Celeste, but they've been watching you for a long time. They know who you are, who you were." The last word hit her like a punch to the chest. Who you were. The words echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder that something about her past had been erased, something that had been kept from her. She could feel the jagged edges of the memories she had been chasing for weeks, the ones that slipped away as soon as she grasped them. And now, there was something that had been waiting for her to remember. Rowan seemed to sense her confusion, his gaze softening just a fraction. "It's complicated. I wish I could explain everything to you. But the truth is, it's not just about us. It's about who you were before all of this, before you lost your memory." Celeste's mind reeled, but she pushed forward, her voice trembling. "Before I lost my memory? What are you talking about? What am I missing, Rowan?" Rowan's eyes flickered, a flicker of something old, something painful. He took a step closer to her, the distance between them shrinking, but the emotional gap seemed wider than ever. His voice softened, as though he was choosing his words carefully. "I can't tell you everything. Not yet. But you need to understand, Celeste, you're not just anyone. You never were. And the people who are after you, they're not here by accident." Her chest tightened with fear, but she forced herself to breathe, to focus. "Then who are they? Why are they after me?" He paused, his gaze intense, before he answered, his voice a low whisper that felt too heavy to carry. "They're part of something much older, something you were once connected to. A secret that goes back long before you ever arrived in this town. A secret." The word hung in the air between them like an unsolved riddle, but Celeste wasn't sure she wanted to hear the rest. She had always known there were pieces of her past that were missing, but hearing Rowan speak about it like this, about ancient secrets and forces beyond her control, was too much. "I don't understand," she whispered, her hands trembling at her sides. "What am I supposed to do with this? How do I remember something I can't even grasp?" Rowan reached out, his hand hovering near hers, but he didn't touch her. Instead, he looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "You don't have to remember all of it right away, but you will, when the time comes." You just have to trust me. Trust him. The words stung, but they also settled somewhere deep inside her. She wanted to trust him more than anything. But the truth he was hinting at felt like an abyss, a yawning chasm that threatened to swallow her whole. What was he not telling her? And how could she trust him when she didn't even know who she was? Celeste drew in a shaky breath, her gaze lifting to meet his. What happens now? What are we supposed to do? Rowan hesitated before answering, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her skin prickle. We have to find the answers, Celeste. The answers that you've been searching for. And when you remember, when you finally remember, we'll be ready. His words hung in the air like a promise, or perhaps a warning. Celeste wasn't sure which, but there was something in the way he said it that made her realize the stakes had just risen. Whatever the stranger had come for, whatever part of her past was being dragged to the surface, it was only the beginning. Rowan's hand finally reached out, gently brushing against hers, his touch warm and grounding in the cold air. I'm not leaving you. Not now. Not ever, he said, his voice quiet but unwavering. And for a moment, Celeste felt the weight of his words sink in, felt the strange connection between them pull tighter, like a thread that had been woven through time. She wasn't alone. No matter how fragmented her memories were, she wasn't alone in this. But even as that thought offered a sliver of comfort, the shadow of the stranger's words loomed large in her mind. Someone had been waiting for her to remember, and now that she was starting to piece together the truth, she wasn't sure she could handle what would come next. The snow continued to fall, the world around them silent and still, but inside, Celeste could feel the storm beginning to stir again. The pieces of her past were finally beginning to fall into place, but with them, a darkness was awakening. A darkness that might be closer than she realized. And Celeste had no choice but to face it. Chapter 13. Echoes of a Night Forgotten. The days following the strange encounter in the alley were a blur. Snow fell relentlessly, as though the world itself was trying to bury the past beneath a layer of white. Celeste couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in around her, the weight of Rowan's cryptic words settling heavily on her shoulders. She had asked him for more details, begged for answers to the questions that clung to her every waking thought, but Rowan remained distant, as if keeping something locked away in the deepest corners of himself. They continued to go through the motions, pretending things were normal, but Celeste could feel the tension in every glance, every touch that lingered too long. It wasn't just the snow that made the air heavy. It was the unspoken truth, the looming threat that both of them were too afraid to confront head-on. The town was quieter than usual, the streets nearly deserted, as if everyone had retreated indoors, unwilling to face whatever was coming. One afternoon, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting a soft orange glow over the snow-covered town, Rowan's expression shifted. They were standing together on the porch of her cottage, the cold wind biting at their skin, and for the first time in days, he looked more like the man she had first met, the man with the quiet intensity, the warmth hidden beneath layers of guardedness. "Celeste," he said, his voice low, barely audible over the wind. "There's something I need to show you." She turned to him, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" He hesitated, glancing at the darkening sky before meeting her eyes. There was a strange urgency in his gaze, a sense that whatever was coming, they had no more time to waste. "I think it's time we confront what's been haunting you," he said, his voice steady despite the underlying tension. "But you have to trust me. This won't be easy." Celeste's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about? What do you mean?" Rowan stepped closer, taking her hand in his grip firm but not unkind. "The stranger who showed up the other night? They were right about one thing. You have memories that go beyond this life, Celeste. Memories of something ancient. something that connects you to this place in ways you can't understand yet. She felt a chill run through her, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. This was it, the moment when everything would be laid bare. The moment when she would be forced to confront whatever dark, buried secret had been following her all this time. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Rowan gave her a faint, reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "There's a place deep in the forest. It's hidden, but it's where your past begins. Where we begin." Celeste's breath caught in her throat. "I don't understand. I don't." "You will," Rowan interrupted gently. "Come with me, and we'll figure it out together." With no more words, he turned and began walking toward the edge of town, where the woods began to stretch out like a shadow against the pale horizon. The wind picked up, swirling around them as if it, too, was trying to push them forward. Celeste hesitated for only a moment before following, her legs heavy with the weight of uncertainty. They walked in silence, the snow crunching beneath their feet, the world around them growing more distant with each step. The forest loomed ahead, its tall, dark trees forming an impenetrable wall of shadows. The further they went, the quieter it became, as though the very air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Rowan led her deeper into the woods, his pace steady, as though he had walked this path 1,000 times before. Celeste couldn't help but wonder just how much he knew about this place, about the secrets buried here. She could feel the pull of something ancient, something that had been waiting for her, beckoning her closer. After what felt like an eternity of walking through the thickening snow, they reached a clearing. In the center, an old stone structure stood, half hidden by the snow and the encroaching trees. It was small, more of a ruin than a building, the stones worn and covered with moss. Celeste's heart skipped in her chest as she recognized the place, though she had no memory of ever being here before. "Do you remember this place?" Rowan asked softly, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of recognition. Celeste shook her head, her voice trembling. "I don't, but I feel like I should." Rowan stepped closer, his presence grounding her as he placed a hand on the cold stone. "This is where it all started, Celeste. This is where your past begins to unravel." The air around them seemed to shift, a sudden tension filling the space. Celeste could feel it now, the weight of something ancient, something that had been waiting here for her, hidden beneath the layers of time and snow. "Tell me everything," Celeste whispered, her voice barely a breath. Rowan nodded, his expression serious. "This place is more than just an old ruin. It's a gateway, a connection to something that predates everything you've known, something that was buried long ago, something you were a part of." A sharp pang of fear pierced her chest. "What do you mean? What was I a part of?" Rowan's eyes darkened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something like sorrow in his gaze. "A legacy, Celeste. A legacy that has been lost to time. And you are the key." Celeste felt a shiver run through her, the cold suddenly seeping into her bones. But it wasn't just the winter chill. It was the weight of Rowan's words, the burden of something she wasn't ready to face. "What am I supposed to do?" she whispered, her voice trembling as she looked up at him, desperate for answers. Rowan's gaze softened, his hand reaching out to gently cup her face. "Remember, Celeste. You have to remember. Only then will you understand why all of this is happening." With a deep breath, he turned to face the stone structure, his eyes filled with determination. He reached out, his fingers brushing the surface of the stones, and for a brief moment, Celeste felt the air around them shift once again. The ground beneath her feet seemed to hum, a quiet vibration that reverberated through her body. "Now," Rowan said quietly, "we begin," and as he stepped forward, a sense of inevitability washed over Celeste. a feeling that everything was about to change. She didn't know what was waiting for her, but she knew that the storm she had been running from had finally caught up to her, and there would be no escaping it now. Chapter 14. The Artist's Hidden Canvas. The moment Rowan touched the stone, Celeste felt it, a tremor in the air, a vibration deep in the earth that seemed to pull at her very soul. The cold wind that had been biting at her cheeks now felt like it was swirling around her, pulling her in different directions. She tried to step closer, but the force of the energy emanating from the stone was almost too much to bear. Her legs felt unsteady, as though they were no longer her own, and for a moment, she wondered if she might collapse under the weight of it all. Rowan stood still, his eyes closed, his expression unreadable, as if he were communing with the very essence of the place. The soft hum that had begun when his fingers touched the stone grew louder, more intense, filling the air with a strange, almost melodic rhythm. It was as though the earth itself was speaking, whispering secrets from the past that Celeste was not yet ready to hear. Rowan. Celeste's voice trembled, her body shivering from more than just the cold. What is this? What's happening? He didn't answer right away, as though he hadn't heard her, lost in the connection between himself and the ancient structure. But after a long pause, he finally opened his eyes, his gaze meeting hers with a mixture of concern and determination. "It's starting," he said softly. "The memories, the truth. It's all coming back now." Celeste's heart pounded in her chest. The truth. The very word echoed in her mind like a warning. She had been chasing fragments of her past, bits and pieces that slipped through her fingers like smoke. But now, standing here in this strange, ancient place, it felt as though everything she had ever known, or thought she knew, was about to unravel. "Do you see it, Celeste?" Rowan asked, his voice hushed but urgent. "Do you feel it?" Celeste shook her head, her mind a swirling mess of confusion. "I don't understand. What's happening to me? Why am I here?" Rowan's eyes softened, a flicker of sadness crossing his face. "You're not the person you think you are, Celeste. You've been running from your past, but it's never really left you. It's been waiting for you to come back." Celeste's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean? I don't remember anything before this. Before you. You don't remember because you weren't supposed to," Rowan said, his voice steady, but with an edge of something darker beneath it. "But now the time has come. You need to remember, Celeste. You need to remember who you were before." A cold shiver ran through her, but she couldn't look away from him. The force of his words, the weight of his gaze, made her feel as though he were somehow pulling her into a reality she wasn't prepared for. A reality that felt far too big for her to comprehend. Before she could speak, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. The stones in the clearing trembled, and suddenly, an image flashed before her eyes. A vision, vivid and overwhelming. She saw a woman. Someone who looked like her, but older, stronger, more commanding. The woman stood in front of a vast expanse of snow, her face turned toward the horizon as if she were waiting for something, or someone. Her eyes were fierce, filled with a fire Celeste didn't recognize, yet somehow felt deep in her own chest. The vision flickered, and suddenly the woman was surrounded by others. Figures cloaked in shadow, their faces indistinguishable, their movements swift and fluid like whispers in the wind. They surrounded her, their intentions unreadable, but their presence unmistakably threatening. Before Celeste could make sense of the scene, the image vanished, replaced by the overwhelming feeling of being lost, abandoned. Her breath hitched in her throat as she stumbled backward, the force of the vision leaving her dizzy, disoriented. "What was that?" she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. Rowan stepped forward, his hand gently grasping her shoulder to steady her. "It's just the beginning," he murmured. The memories are starting to break through. What you saw, that's part of who you were. A part of your past. Celeste swallowed hard, her heart racing as she tried to gather her thoughts. But I don't understand. Who was that woman? Was it me? Rowan's expression faltered, a brief flicker of uncertainty passing through his eyes before he hid it again. Yes, that was you. Or rather, the you before everything changed, before you were lost. The weight of his words hit her like a physical blow. She tried to make sense of it, but the puzzle pieces didn't fit together. Who had she been before? And why had she been so desperate to forget? What happened to me? She whispered, her voice breaking. Why can't I remember? Rowan's gaze darkened, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the very air around them grew heavier, the temperature dropping several degrees. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, a low, guttural sound echoed through the clearing, an unnatural noise that seemed to come from the earth itself. Celeste froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was a sound she had never heard before, a sound that sent a chill of fear crawling up her spine. Rowan's expression shifted from concern to one of steely determination. We have to go. Now. Go? What's happening? Celeste's voice trembled, but she didn't question him. She could feel it too. Something dangerous was approaching. Rowan didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed her hand tightly, pulling her toward the edge of the clearing. The air felt heavier now, thick with an impending sense of doom. As they reached the edge of the forest, Celeste glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, emerging from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the snow falling gently, the world eerily silent. But she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been stirred here, whatever dark force had awakened in that ancient stone structure, was following them. As they walked in hurried silence through the snow-covered forest, Rowan's grip on her hand tightened, but she didn't dare ask him anything more. She could feel the urgency in his movements, the fear that he was trying desperately to hide. It wasn't just the memories that were returning to Celeste. It was something else, something far more dangerous, and it was clear that they were both running from it. The storm had come, and it was only just beginning. Chapter 15. A Face in the Painting. The journey back to the cottage felt interminable, every step through the thick snow dragging them deeper into an unknown future. Rowan had pulled Celeste away from the clearing with an urgency that bordered on desperation, but even as they fled, she couldn't shake the sensation that something, or someone, was following them. The forest behind them seemed to shift and bend, as though it were alive, watching their every move. Celeste's breath came in shallow gasps, her body trembling not only from the cold, but from the weight of what had just happened. Her mind whirled with the fragments of the vision she'd seen. The woman who looked like her, but was somehow different, more powerful, and the strange figures that had surrounded her. The feeling of being lost, abandoned. There were questions she couldn't yet answer, but the deeper they ventured into the woods, the more she realized she might not have time to find those answers. Rowan was ahead of her, moving quickly, his eyes scanning the trees as though searching for something in the shadows. His face was tense, his jaw clenched. She had never seen him like this, so fully on edge, so consumed by something beyond her understanding. He glanced back once, catching her gaze, and for a brief moment, she saw the fear in his eyes. It was fleeting, but it was enough to make her heart stutter in her chest. "What's happening, Rowan?" she asked, her voice cracking despite her efforts to sound calm. "What are we running from?" He didn't answer at first, his eyes narrowing as he looked over his shoulder again, the silent woods echoing back only their footsteps. Then, finally, his voice broke the stillness, low and strained. "I don't know, but something's wrong. The stone. It's waking up things it shouldn't." "What do you mean, waking up things?" Celeste demanded, her anxiety rising as her thoughts continued to churn. That place. What did you mean when you said my past is tied to it? Rowan's pace slowed, and he stopped abruptly in the middle of their path, turning to face her. His eyes were dark with an intensity that both unsettled and drew her in. For a moment, he seemed to be weighing something, perhaps the decision of whether or not to tell her more. But in the end, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the very trees might be listening. You're not just Celeste, the woman who arrived here a few months ago, he said slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. You're something more. Someone more. Celeste's breath caught, and she took an instinctive step back, as though the words themselves had physical weight. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling, unable to comprehend what he was telling her. What is that supposed to mean? Rowan took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging slightly as though he were carrying a burden too heavy to bear. You were born here, Celeste. This place, this town, it's part of you. And so are the things buried beneath it. Celeste shook her head in disbelief, her mind racing to make sense of his words. But I don't remember anything about this place. You said it yourself. I have no memory of before. That's because it was taken from you, Rowan said quietly, stepping closer, his voice filled with a mix of regret and determination. They erased it. They had to protect you. But now it's all coming back. Who took my memories? She demanded, her heart racing in her chest. Who erased them? Rowan's expression darkened. I'm not sure, but I suspect it has something to do with the others. The ones who came before. The others? Celeste repeated, feeling as though the ground beneath her was slipping away. Who are you talking about? Rowan hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the surrounding forest as though expecting someone, or something, to appear at any moment. Then, with a resigned sigh, he spoke again. The people you saw in the vision, he said, his voice growing more urgent. The ones who surrounded you. They weren't just figments of your past life. They were protectors, Celeste. Guardians of the town, of the legacy that runs through your blood. Celeste felt a sickening knot form in her stomach. Guardians? Protectors of what? Rowan took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The town is built on something ancient, Celeste, something powerful, and you, your bloodline, is tied to it, to the force that lies beneath it all. Is that what I saw in the clearing? She asked, her voice barely above a breath. Is that why I felt the power? The energy? Rowan nodded slowly, his eyes clouded with a mixture of fear and understanding. Yes, you felt it because it's part of you. It's in you, Celeste. The words hung in the air between them like a heavy fog, and Celeste could barely process them. She had always felt different, but now the pieces were falling into place. The visions, the strange pull she had felt toward the town, the unsettling sense that something had been waiting for her. It was all connected. But why? What was she supposed to do with this knowledge? Why didn't you tell me this sooner? Celeste asked, her voice thick with emotion. Why did you hide this from me? Rowan's gaze softened, and he reached for her hand, his grip gentle but firm. I didn't want to overwhelm you. I thought if we gave you time, you might remember on your own. But now it's too late for that. Whatever's coming is already here, and we have to be ready. Celeste's mind was reeling, but there was something in Rowan's eyes, something she couldn't ignore, something that made her believe he wasn't lying. He wasn't just speaking of ancient myths or legends. He was speaking of a truth that connected her to this place in ways she hadn't yet begun to understand. But one thing was clear. The storm she had been running from wasn't just a metaphor. It was real, and it was coming for them both. Ready for what? She asked, her voice tight with fear and uncertainty. Rowan turned away, his expression hardening, as if bracing himself for what was to come. We don't have much time. Whatever is waking up in the woods, it's not something we can run from. We have to face it head on. Face it, Celeste echoed, her heart pounding in her chest. How do we even begin to fight something like this? Rowan paused, looking back at her over his shoulder. I don't know, but I do know that we're in this together. Whatever happens next, we face it as one. The weight of his words settled over her, and Celeste realized with a mixture of dread and determination that she no longer had a choice. The town, her memories, and the strange, ancient force buried deep beneath the earth. It was all part of her, and there was no turning back now. As they continued on through the snow, Rowan at her side, the storm in the distance grew louder, its fury echoing through the trees. The town was no longer a quiet place of refuge. It had become the epicenter of something far greater, far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. And as the wind howled around them, Celeste knew one thing for certain. The past was rising to meet her, and she had no idea how it would change everything. Chapter 16. Love Lost, Love Found. The cold air felt like needles against Celeste's skin as she trudged beside Rowan through the dense, snow-covered forest. The wind had picked up, swirling through the trees and making it difficult to see much beyond the immediate path they were on. Despite the harsh conditions, there was something oddly familiar about the way the snow crunched beneath their boots, like a memory she couldn't fully grasp. Rowan moved ahead with purpose, his footsteps sure and steady. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, even though Celeste had no idea what lay ahead. She was still reeling from the bombshell he had dropped on her. The revelation that her bloodline was tied to something ancient, something dangerous buried beneath the town. The weight of those words pressed down on her chest, and every time she tried to push them away, they returned, heavier than before. "What are we heading toward?" she asked, her voice cutting through the howling wind. Her breath formed clouds in the cold air, but it was the least of her worries. Rowan glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. "A place," he said, his voice low. "A place that might hold the answers to everything." "We're close now." Celeste frowned, her heart thudding in her chest. "Answers to what?" "To you," Rowan answered simply, his gaze fixed ahead. "To the stone, to your past, and to what's coming." They walked in silence for a moment, the sound of their footsteps almost drowned by the wind. Celeste's mind raced, thoughts and emotions colliding in a disorienting whirlwind. The stone, the visions, the woman she had seen in the clearing. It was all tied together, and the more she tried to make sense of it, the more elusive the answers became. But Rowan had said they were close, and something inside her told her that this was a journey they couldn't turn back from. Eventually, they arrived at the edge of the forest, where the trees thinned out and the ground beneath their feet began to slope downward. The snow-covered landscape stretched before them, vast and empty, but in the distance, there was a flicker of light. It was faint, almost like a beacon, cutting through the darkness of the approaching storm. Rowan's pace quickened, and Celeste followed, feeling a strange pull toward the light. It was as if the force that had been gathering inside her since her arrival in the town was now urging her forward, guiding her steps. They moved swiftly, their breath coming in heavy gasps as the light grew brighter, more distinct. And then they arrived. In front of them stood a massive stone arch, its edges covered in layers of frost and ivy, its surface etched with strange symbols. The light was emanating from within the arch, a soft, ethereal glow that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was as if the arch was a doorway, a threshold between worlds, and Celeste could feel the energy radiating from it, vibrating through her very bones. "This is it," Rowan said, his voice tight with emotion. He stepped forward. his hand outstretched as though he were reaching for something beyond the arch. This is where it all began. Celeste stared at the arch, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't fully understand what she was seeing, but there was no mistaking the significance of the place. The symbols on the stone, the glow of the light, it all felt deeply familiar, as if she had been here before. A part of her was terrified, but another part of her, a part she didn't fully understand, was drawn to it. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast silence. "It's an ancient gateway," Rowan explained, his eyes fixed on the arch, "a place where the past and future collide, where the truth of who you are is buried, waiting to be uncovered." Celeste took a tentative step forward, her breath catching in her throat. The air around the arch seemed to shimmer, like the veil between two worlds was thinning. The light inside pulsed again, brighter this time, and she felt something stir within her. A recognition, a calling. It was as if the arch was speaking to her, urging her to step forward. "I don't know if I can do this," Celeste said, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "What if I'm not ready? What if I'm not who you think I am?" Rowan turned to her then, his gaze soft but filled with a fierce intensity. "You are exactly who you are supposed to be," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. "You are stronger than you know. You've already faced so much, Celeste. Don't turn away now." She looked at him, searching his face for any hint of doubt, but all she saw was conviction. And something else, something deeper, something that resonated within her own soul. The connection between them had always been undeniable, but now, in this moment, it felt like something more, something destined. With a deep breath, Celeste took a step toward the arch. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, a wave of energy washed over her, electrifying her senses. Her heart raced, her mind spinning with 1,000 fragmented memories that didn't belong to her. Memories of a life she had never lived, a world she had never known. She gasped, her hand flying to her chest as the vision began to take shape. She was no longer standing at the stone arch. She was somewhere else entirely. A different place, a different time. The air was thick with magic, and she could feel it, pulsing in the ground beneath her feet, flowing through the trees and the very air she breathed. Figures stood around her, cloaked in shadows, their faces obscured but their presence undeniable. They were watching her, waiting for something. Her. She was the one they had been waiting for. A woman stepped forward from the shadows, her face eerily familiar, and Celeste's heart skipped a beat. It was her, but not. The woman had the same features, the same eyes, but there was a hardness in her gaze, a sense of power that Celeste couldn't comprehend. "You've returned," the woman said, her voice cold and commanding. "It's time to finish what was started." Before Celeste could react, the vision shattered, and she was back at the arch, gasping for air, her hands shaking. Rowan was beside her in an instant, his touch grounding her as she tried to steady her breath. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Celeste nodded, though her mind was still reeling. I saw something. Someone. It was me, but it wasn't. She said it was time to finish something." Rowan's expression darkened, and he stepped closer, his voice urgent. "I was afraid of this. The past is trying to claim you again, but you can't let it. You have to choose your own path, Celeste." Celeste nodded, her hand gripping his tightly. She didn't know what was coming, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. Whatever the past had in store, she was no longer running from it. As the storm raged on around them, Celeste stood tall at the threshold of the arch, knowing that the true battle was only just beginning. Chapter 17. The Truth Beneath the Frost. The storm continued to swirl around them, its icy gusts tearing at their clothes, making the air thick and almost suffocating. Celeste stood on the edge of the ancient arch, her fingers still tightly clutching Rowan's, the echoes of the vision lingering in her mind. The figure of the woman, the other her, kept flashing in her mind's eye, her words haunting. It's time to finish what was started. But what was she talking about? What had been started? And why was Celeste seeing a life she hadn't lived? Her heart raced as she tried to piece together the fragments of her vision, but every attempt only sent her thoughts spiraling in a direction that left her feeling more lost than ever. Rowan's voice broke through her haze, his words grounding her. "Celeste," he said, his tone soft but firm. "We can't stay here. The gateway is open. We need to move before." Before what? She didn't know. She didn't know anything anymore. But she did know one thing. She couldn't ignore the pull. The pull of the arch. The pull of the past. It was like a thread winding through her very soul, and despite the fear that gripped her chest, she knew she had to follow it. "I don't know what's happening to me," she whispered, her voice barely audible against the roar of the wind. "These visions, this feeling, it's all too much. I'm not ready for this." Rowan's eyes softened, and for a moment, there was a tenderness in his gaze that reached into her very core. He stepped closer, his hand brushing a strand of hair away from her face, his touch warm against the cold. "You don't have to be ready," he said gently. "Sometimes we don't have a choice in the matter, but we're in this together. I'm not leaving you, Celeste. I won't let you face it alone." Celeste's heart tightened at his words. It was the first time he had spoken so openly about staying, about being with her through whatever came next. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead was darker than either of them could predict. The weight of her bloodline, the power within her, the ancient forces that seemed to be pulling her in directions she couldn't understand. It was too much. She took a shaky breath and turned back to the arch, the glowing light still pulsing in time with her heartbeat. The stone seemed to shimmer in the dark, as though it were alive, beckoning her closer. She could feel it now, the pull, deeper than before. A part of her resisted, but another part, one she had never fully acknowledged until this moment, wanted to step through that threshold. Rowan stood beside her, his eyes never leaving hers. "What do you feel?" he asked, his voice low and careful. "I don't know," Celeste admitted, "but it feels like I've been here before. Like I've always known this moment was coming." His grip tightened on her hand. "Then let's face it together. If this is what you need to do, we'll do it. But you have to trust yourself, Celeste." Trust herself? It was a difficult thing to do when everything in her felt so fractured, so broken. Her entire life had been a series of unanswered questions, and now, standing at the edge of something ancient and powerful, she realized how little she truly understood. Her past was a fog, her future uncertain, and she was being asked to step into it, without any real answers. But Rowan was right. They couldn't stand here forever. They couldn't keep running. The only way forward was to move through the unknown. She nodded slowly, the decision weighing heavily on her shoulders. "Okay," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "Let's do it." Without another word, she took a step forward, crossing the threshold of the arch. The moment her foot touched the ground on the other side, a rush of energy swept over her, flooding her senses. Her head spun, her heart pounding, and her knees nearly buckled beneath the overwhelming force. She gasped, her vision blurring as flashes of the past, the present, and the future collided in a dizzying whirlwind. Images of the town, of the forest, the clearing, the stone, flashed in her mind, each one more vivid than the last. But amidst the chaos of visions, there was one that stood out, clear and unmistakable. She saw herself standing in the center of a circle, the same woman from her vision beside her, their hands outstretched towards something in the center. The air was thick with magic, the earth beneath them pulsing with a power that seemed both alive and ancient. And in the distance, a shadow loomed, moving closer, darker than the night. It was then that Celeste realized the woman in the vision wasn't just someone from her past. She was her, but in another life, in a life that had been lost, erased. And the shadow, the danger, it wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It was real, and it was coming. Celeste. Rowan's voice cut through the chaos, and she felt his hand on her arm, grounding her, pulling her back. She blinked, the vision fading, the world around her slowly coming back into focus. They were no longer in the forest, no longer in the storm. The air was still, the only sound the distant rustling of leaves. Celeste looked around, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The arch was gone, replaced by a sprawling, forgotten courtyard. The stone beneath their feet was worn and cracked, the remnants of ancient pathways snaking through the overgrown grass. The sky above them was an eerie shade of purple, the first stars just beginning to pierce the darkening horizon. "This place," Celeste whispered, her voice trembling. "It's real." Rowan stood beside her, his expression grave. "This is where it all began. The place where your bloodline story was written, and it's where it will be decided." Celeste's heart clenched as she took in her surroundings. The courtyard, the remnants of a long-lost civilization, all seemed to resonate with the power of the past. It was as if the earth itself held its breath, waiting for her next move. She took a step forward, her body tense, her mind racing. The feeling of inevitability was overwhelming, but so was the sense of purpose. She didn't fully understand what was happening or why, but for the first time, Celeste felt a clarity she hadn't known before. She wasn't just the woman who had stumbled into this town, seeking answers. She was the key to something much larger, something much older. And whatever happened next, she couldn't turn away. Rowan's hand brushed against hers again, his presence a steady anchor in the uncertainty. "You're not alone, Celeste. Whatever comes, we face it together." She looked at him then, her heart aching with a mixture of gratitude and fear. He had been her constant, her strength, and she knew, without a shadow of doubt, that they would have to face the darkness together. And so, with one final breath, Celeste stepped deeper into the courtyard, ready to confront the truth that had been waiting for her all along. Chapter 18. The Truth Beneath the Frost. The courtyard was still, save for the wind that whispered through the ancient stones, carrying with it a strange, quiet hum. It wasn't the kind of sound that belonged in nature. It felt more like an echo, a remnant of something long past, stirring to life again. Celeste's heart beat in time with the faint rhythm, an instinctual pull guiding her deeper into the forgotten space. Rowan was beside her, his presence a steady comfort amidst the growing tension that tightened around them like a web. They had entered this realm, this place where the past and future seemed to meet, and now they had to face whatever lay in wait. Celeste's eyes swept over the ruins, the once grand pillars now crumbling with age, the walls etched with symbols and runes she could not comprehend. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, but the strange energy that lingered here was unmistakable. It was as if the very air was charged, alive with magic. The power of the land, the power of her bloodline, coursed through every stone and every crack in the earth. "Do you feel that?" she whispered to Rowan, her voice barely more than a breath. He nodded, his eyes dark with understanding. "It's like everything is waiting for you." Celeste shuddered, uncertain whether the statement comforted or frightened her. She wasn't sure she was ready to face whatever was coming. She had spent so many years running from the truth, afraid of the weight of her legacy, afraid of what it meant to be tied to something so ancient and powerful. But there was no turning back now. The visions, the arch, the storm, they had all brought her here. and now she was standing at the threshold of something she couldn't quite understand but knew she had to unlock. "Where do we go from here?" Celeste asked, her eyes scanning the courtyard for some clue, some indication of the next step. Rowan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, walking slowly, almost reverently, towards the center of the courtyard. Celeste followed him, her boots crunching against the gravel as she walked, her eyes fixed on the spot where Rowan stood. It was a small platform of stone, elevated slightly from the ground, and etched into its surface was a symbol Celeste had seen before. The same symbol from her vision, the one that had glowed in the clearing, the one that had marked her bloodline as something special, something destined. Rowan turned to face her as she approached, his expression unreadable. "This is where it begins," he said softly, his voice heavy with meaning. Celeste's breath caught in her chest as she took in the symbol. It was intricate, woven with loops and curves that seemed to dance together, yet there was something primal about it, something old and powerful that resonated deep within her. She could almost feel the pulse of it, as if it were calling to her, urging her to step forward. "You have to place your hand on it," Rowan said, his voice quiet but insistent. "That's the only way." Celeste hesitated, a swirl of conflicting emotions churning within her. She wanted to be brave. She wanted to take control of this moment, to embrace the destiny that seemed to be waiting for her. But a small part of her, the part that had always been afraid, wanted to turn back, to run, to avoid the unknown. But Rowan was here, and he was with her. She couldn't do this alone, and he had promised to stay by her side. That promise anchored her, and with a deep breath, she stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached toward the symbol. The moment her fingers brushed the stone, a surge of energy rushed through her, sharp and powerful, like a bolt of lightning striking her very soul. She gasped, her body stiffening as the power coursed through her. It was raw, ancient, and it felt like it had been waiting for her touch for centuries. The air around them seemed to shift, the world tilting and spinning as the magic began to awaken. The wind howled louder now, and the ground beneath them trembled, the courtyard coming alive in a way that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Celeste's vision blurred as images flashed before her eyes. She saw her ancestors, figures cloaked in robes of silver and gold, standing in the very spot where she stood now, their hands raised to the sky as they called upon the magic that flowed through their blood. They were powerful, their eyes alight with purpose, their faces stern and determined. And then, she saw herself, this version of herself. She was young, full of hope, standing tall and confident in the same spot, ready to take her place in the line of those who had come before her. But as the vision shifted, Celeste saw another version of herself, a version that was broken, lost, consumed by fear and doubt. The two versions of herself collided in her mind, each pulling her in a different direction, each demanding something from her that she wasn't sure she could give. The energy around her intensified, the force of it nearly knocking her off her feet. The wind howled louder, and the ground beneath them seemed to shift, becoming unstable. Celeste gasped, her hands clutching the stone as she tried to ground herself, to hold on to something real. "Celeste." Rowan's voice reached her through the chaos, but it felt distant, as if he were calling to her from across a vast expanse. "You have to focus. You have to trust yourself." But Celeste wasn't sure she could. She wasn't sure she could trust anything anymore. The vision, the power, it was all too much. It was like trying to hold on to something slipping through her fingers, something that was meant to be hers, but felt too heavy to bear. Her hand burned where it touched the symbol, the power of it seeping into her very being. She could feel it, feel her bloodline awakening within her. It's called growing louder, more insistent. She had always known there was something inside her, something that set her apart, but now she was beginning to understand the truth of it. It was her legacy, her birthright, but it was also her burden, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to carry it. But Rowan's voice reached her again, stronger this time. "Celeste, you have to embrace it. You can't run from who you are. Not anymore." With his words ringing in her ears, Celeste closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't have to understand everything right now, but she couldn't let fear rule her anymore. She had come this far, and she would not let this moment slip away. Slowly, she exhaled and opened her eyes, and as she did, the energy around her surged once more. This time, not with chaos, but with clarity. The visions faded, the wind died down, and for the first time, Celeste felt as though she were in control. She felt the power flowing through her, and she realized it wasn't something to fear. It was a part of her, a part of who she had always been. Her hand glowed, the symbol beneath her palm lighting up with a brilliant white light that spread outward, illuminating the entire courtyard. And in that moment, Celeste understood. This was her moment. The moment where time and destiny met, where she could finally step into her true self. The question remained, what would she do with that power? Would she use it to change her fate? Would she use it to protect what she loved? The future was wide open, and for the first time, Celeste was ready to step forward. Chapter 19. A Choice at Midnight. The courtyard had fallen eerily silent, the last echoes of the energy that had once pulsed through the air now dissipating into the crisp winter night. The glowing symbol under Celeste's hand had dimmed, its brilliance fading to a soft, steady glow as the earth seemed to breathe once more. But though the magic had settled, the weight of what had just transpired remained heavy in the air, swirling around them like an unspoken promise. Celeste stood, her fingers still lightly resting on the stone, her heart racing in the aftershock of what she had just experienced. It felt as though the very ground beneath her had shifted, as if the past and future were now intertwined in ways she couldn't quite grasp. But one thing was clear. Something had changed within her. The ancient magic had stirred her blood, awakened parts of her she hadn't known existed. She felt different, stronger, but also more vulnerable than she had ever felt before. Rowan, who had been watching her with a mixture of awe and concern, took a careful step toward her. His eyes were wide, his face etched with an unspoken understanding of the power that now flowed through her. "Celeste," he said softly, his voice a low, steady anchor in the sea of emotions swirling around them. "Are you okay?" She swallowed, her throat dry as she tried to gather herself. She nodded, though her mind still felt hazy from the intensity of the experience. She pulled her hand from the stone, her fingers tingling as the connection to the symbol loosened. For a moment, she wasn't sure whether the strength she felt was her own or the remnants of the power that had surged through her. But then Rowan stepped closer, his presence grounding her, and she felt the tumult inside her begin to settle. She met his gaze, her heart swelling with something she hadn't dared to fully acknowledge until now. I think I'm ready," Celeste whispered, the words tasting foreign on her lips but also deeply true. Rowan's expression softened, his eyes never leaving hers. "I knew you would be." For a long moment, they stood there, the silence between them charged with something deeper, something unspoken but understood. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for them to take the next step, to decide what came next. Finally, it was Celeste who broke the silence, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts and emotions still rushing through her. "I know what I have to do now. I know where I belong," she said, her gaze turning towards the horizon, where the first light of dawn was beginning to break through the darkness, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. The world was slowly waking up, and with it, Celeste felt as though she, too, was awakening from a long slumber. Rowan's eyes followed her gaze, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was colder now, but it wasn't the biting chill of the night. It was the crispness of new beginnings, of something shifting in the world. Celeste felt it in her bones, the certainty that whatever had begun here, whatever had been awakened in her, was just the beginning of something both terrifying and beautiful. She turned back to Rowan, her expression resolute. "I have to go back to the village. There's still so much to be done." Rowan nodded, his features tight with understanding. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. He knew, just as she did, that this wasn't something she could walk away from. This was her path now, and there was no turning back. But before either of them could say another word, a distant sound reached their ears, a low hum, growing steadily louder as though something ancient and powerful was awakening with them. Celeste's heart skipped a beat, and she felt a familiar pull in her chest, like a tether was connecting her to something far beyond the courtyard. It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't entirely reassuring either. The hum turned into a voice Celeste recognized. Her heart clenched. Alara! The name slipped from her lips, a whisper that carried both hope and fear. It was Alara's voice, soft but clear, coming from somewhere beyond the courtyard, beyond the stone walls that seemed to close in around them. Rowan's gaze flickered to her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What's happening, Celeste?" I don't know," she admitted, her mind racing to piece together the fragments of her vision, the sensation that had gripped her heart when she had felt the magic surge. "But I think Alara's trying to tell me something." With a quick glance at Rowan, Celeste started walking toward the sound, her footsteps light on the snow as though the earth itself was guiding her forward. Rowan hesitated for only a moment before following her, his footsteps matching hers in the deepening quiet. The hum grew louder, more distinct, until Celeste found herself standing before a massive oak tree, its branches reaching high into the sky like ancient arms, protecting something hidden deep within. The air around it shimmered, as though reality itself was bending in response to the power contained in its roots. "Alara!" Celeste called out, her voice ringing clear and strong. "Where are you?" The wind picked up, swirling around her, and then the voice came again, closer this time, almost as if it were right beside her, though there was no one in sight. "I am here, Celeste," the voice said, gentle yet urgent. "You must be ready. The storm you've unlocked, it is only the beginning. The power within you is the key to everything, to both the light and the darkness that are tied to your fate. You must choose which path you will walk." Celeste's heart stuttered in her chest as she tried to make sense of the words. The storm, the power within her. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected the weight of her choice to be so enormous. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain steady. "What choice do I have?" The voice seemed to pause for a moment, and then the answer came, slow and deliberate. "You must decide how to wield the magic that now flows within you. Will you use it to protect what you love, to create something new? Or will you allow it to consume you, as it has consumed others before you?" The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Celeste stood frozen, her mind reeling. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like 1,000 tons, and for the first time, she realized the full extent of what she had unlocked. This power, it was hers, but it came with consequences. Rowan stood beside her, his hand brushing against hers, grounding her in the moment. He didn't say anything, but his presence was enough. He was here. He was with her, and that was all that mattered. Celeste took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs, and she closed her eyes, feeling the magic swirling inside her, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She would face it head-on. She would make her choice, and whatever came next, she would be ready. As she opened her eyes, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, bathing the world in soft gold. The storm was far behind them, and now, before her, stretched a new path, one of her own making. The future was hers to shape, and with Rowan by her side, Celeste knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Chapter 20. When the snow falls again. The snowflakes fell like silver dust from the heavens, each one a delicate, perfect testament to the passage of time. It was almost as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something profound to unfold. The air was crisp, biting, and yet there was a warmth that lingered between Celeste and Rowan, an undeniable connection that neither could deny, even after all they had endured. Celeste stood at the edge of the village, her gaze tracing the horizon where the snow-capped mountains met the soft golden glow of the setting sun. There was a sense of finality in the air, as if the world had come full circle. The storm had passed, the magic had been unlocked, and the choice had been made. And yet, the journey was far from over. Rowan stood beside her, his hand tucked into the crook of her elbow, his presence a quiet reassurance. They had faced the unknown together, fought the shadows, and found a bond stronger than either of them had ever imagined. And now, as the last remnants of the storm melted away, the promise of something new stretched out before them like an untouched canvas, waiting to be filled with their story. "Do you ever wonder how we got here?" Rowan asked, his voice low and contemplative. He was looking at the same view, but Celeste could sense the quiet storm in his heart. It wasn't fear nor doubt, but something else, something deeper that had been uncovered during their shared trials. Celeste glanced at him, her heart swelling with something she couldn't put into words. There was so much she had learned in the time they had spent together. About love, about loss, about sacrifice and healing. And yet, it was in this moment, standing at the edge of this new chapter, that she realized how much she still had to learn. "I do," she replied, her voice soft, reflective. "But I think I've stopped wondering about the how and started focusing on the why." Rowan turned toward her, his dark eyes locking onto hers, the weight of her words settling between them like an unspoken vow. The space between them felt charged, like the air before a storm, and yet there was peace in it, an understanding that only the two of them shared. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because," she began, her gaze flickering to the sky above, the clouds slowly parting to reveal a deep, velvet expanse of stars. "We were always meant to find each other. All of this, the magic, the storms, the challenges, it was all leading us here, to this moment, to this choice. And now that we're here, I know that everything else is just a beginning." Rowan's hand found hers, his fingers gently intertwining with hers, as if sealing a pact neither of them had ever fully realized they had made. The warmth of his touch spread through her like a slow fire, filling the emptiness that had once been so familiar to her. And as their fingers pressed together, the world around them seemed to pause, just for a moment. There was no past, no future, only this. Together, then, Rowan said, the words like a promise, a bond that was forged not in words, but in the very air that surrounded them. The promise that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Celeste nodded, her heart swelling with something indescribable. She knew that this moment, this feeling, was something that transcended time. It was a promise that was older than the stars above them, older than the storms they had weathered. It was the promise of forever. As they stood there, hand in hand, the village around them came to life. The warm glow of lights twinkled in the windows of the cottages, and the sound of laughter and music drifted on the wind from the town square. It was Christmas Eve once more, and this time, it felt different. This time, The magic was no longer a threat. It was a blessing. "I can't help but think about how everything changed," Celeste murmured, her gaze tracing the faint outline of the town. "How everything we thought we knew was turned upside down. But now it all makes sense." Rowan's smile was small but meaningful. "I think we've both changed, in ways we never could have imagined." "Yes," Celeste agreed, her voice steady now, no longer uncertain. "And I think that's what makes this all so beautiful. The magic wasn't just about what I unlocked. It was about what we unlocked together." They stood there for a long moment, watching as the stars grew brighter, the first signs of the night drawing their veil over the land. It was peaceful, like the calm after a storm, and yet Celeste felt a restless anticipation in the air, an energy that seemed to hum beneath the surface. Rowan looked at her again, his eyes soft but full of meaning. "And now that the storm is behind us, what happens next?" The question hung in the air between them, like an invitation, a promise of something yet to come. Celeste smiled softly, the weight of everything she had learned and felt coming to a head in that simple question. "Now we live." The answer was simple, but it felt like the truth. Now they lived together, with all the magic, the uncertainty, and the love that had grown between them. There was no more looking over their shoulders, no more wondering if the future would tear them apart. They had faced the darkness, and they had emerged stronger, together. As the first star of the evening flickered into view, Celeste made a quiet wish. Not for the future, not for what might come, but for the here and now. For the promise of more moments like this one. For the love they had found, the love that had survived the storm. Rowan squeezed her hand, and in that moment, the world seemed to fall away. They were no longer alone in the storm. They were no longer separated by the forces that had once kept them apart. They were simply two hearts bound together by something as ancient as the stars themselves. And as the night embraced the village, Celeste and Rowan stood side by side, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it hand in hand. Forever. The end.